The night was cold and silent, until the hills came alive with gunfire. Flashes lit the darkness over Barbadell Puerto, a lonely bridge deep in the mountains of Portugal. 500 British riflemen, the green jackets of the 95th, stood there, surrounded by 6,000 French troops. No reinforcements, no retreat, just the rock beneath their boots and the will to hold. They were outnumbered 12-1, but they didn't break. They didn't run. All night, they fought from the shadows, men against an army, until the dawn rose over a field of silence. This is not a story of victory written in medals or glory. It's a story of grit, courage, and men who refused to fall. The smoke from that night still hangs in history, a reminder of courage few could match. But to understand how 500 men held their ground against an army, we have to step back before the gunfire, before the darkness. Back to the men in green, the sharpshooters who changed the way Britain fought. This is where their story begins. They weren't ordinary soldiers. They wore dark green instead of red, moving fast, fighting smart, and picking their shots with deadly aim. In 1810, during the Peninsular War, they were sent to guard a narrow mountain pass on the border of Portugal and Spain, a place called Barbadell Puerto. The bridge below them was the only crossing for miles. If the French broke through, the road to Portugal would be open, and the British army would be exposed. So Major Sidney Beckwith and his men dug in, knowing what was coming. Across the ravine, French drums echoed in the night. Campfires flickered in the distance, thousands of them. The rifles waited in silence, fingers on the trigger, hearts steady. They were about to face the storm alone, and when the storm finally came, it came without warning. No drums, no daylight, only the whisper of boots in the dark. The rifles gripped their weapons, listening to the silence close in around them. Each man knew what was coming, and that no help would arrive. The night was about to decide who would still be standing by dawn. The night was heavy with fog and silence. Down in the valley, the French were on the move. Thousands of boots pressed into wet soil. Muskets clinked. Officers whispered orders. The moon hid behind clouds, as if afraid to see what was coming. Major Sidney Beckwith stood near the ridge, his cloak brushing against the rocks. He could hear them, the enemy, spreading out in the dark. 6,000 men, crossing the ravine, searching for the bridge. Behind him, only 500 riflemen waited. Most had never seen odds like this before. Some tightened their grips on their Baker rifles. Others simply looked to their officers and nodded. Then it began, a shout in French, followed by the crack of a musket. The silence shattered. The rifles opened fire. Green flashes tore through the darkness. Each shot found its mark. The French stumbled, fell, then charged again, their drums beating a furious rhythm. The sound bounced off the cliffs, a roar of chaos, steel, and courage. The rifles fought in small groups, just as they had trained. No tight lines, no parade formations, only skill, instinct, and grit. From behind rocks, trees, and the broken walls near the bridge, they fired and fell back, then fired again. Every inch of ground cost the French dearly. Beckwith rode between positions, shouting over the thunder of guns. "Hold your ground, lads! Hold it!" His voice cut through the noise, calm but fierce. A French column pushed across the bridge, bayonets glinting, officers waving swords. For a moment, it looked unstoppable. Then the rifle's volley struck, point blank. The bridge vanished in smoke. When the haze cleared, the French line was gone. But the attack didn't stop. Wave after wave came on, climbing over their fallen comrades, desperate to break through. The rifle's powder ran low. Men passed cartridges hand to hand. Some fired until their rifles burned hot. Others fought with bayonets in the mud, face to face with the enemy. Still they stood. The French tried the flanks, scaling the rocks under cover of smoke. But the 95th were hunters. Sharp eyes caught movement and quiet rifles answered. One by one the attackers fell, until even the boldest began to hesitate. Hours passed. The air reeked of gunpowder. The ground was slick with rain and blood. At last, the first light of dawn crept over the hills. What it revealed was silence, broken muskets, fallen banners, and green jackets still holding their ground. The French commander looked across the ravine and saw what was left of his army, exhausted, scattered, and unwilling to go forward again. He gave the only order left to give: retreat. As the French fell back into the mist, the rifles lowered their weapons. They had stood against an army, and won. Their line was thin, their numbers small, but their courage that night carved their name into history. And when the sun finally rose over Barbadell Puerto, the smoke hung thick in the valley. The echo of musket fire had faded, replaced by the slow crackle of burning powder and the groans of the wounded. All night the rifles had fought, moving, from rock to rock, from ruin to ruin. And now at last there was silence. Major Beckwith stood by the bridge, his face streaked with soot. His men were scattered around him, slumped behind cover, too tired to speak. Some reloaded out of habit, though there was no one left to fire at. Others sat staring across the ravine, where the French had disappeared into the morning mist. They had done the impossible. 500 riflemen had held back 6,000. They hadn't just survived, they had stopped an army, but victory didn't feel like glory. The ground was littered with the cost. Shattered rifles, torn uniforms, men lying still among the rocks. The rifles had lost brothers that night. Still, for every British soldier who fell, 10 Frenchmen lay silent. The odds had flipped, and the story of that night would echo far beyond these cliffs. As the wounded were gathered, Beckwith walked the line. He didn't shout orders. He simply nodded to each man who met his eyes, a silent thank you between soldiers who had seen too much. To the young lads who joined thinking war was adventure, this night had taught them what courage truly meant. When news of the defense reached the rest of Wellington's army, it spread like wildfire. 500 held the bridge, they said. In the mess tents, in the camps, in letters home, the name Barbadell Puerto became a symbol. A story of what a handful of determined men could do when the world expected them to fall. As the sun climbed higher, the rifles packed their gear and reformed what was left of their ranks. No cheering, no celebration, only quiet pride. They'd done their duty. And though no medals were pinned that morning, every man who stood on that ridge knew he had been part of something larger than himself. When they marched away, the valley behind them was silent once more. Only the green coats of the 95th moved against the morning light, outnumbered, surrounded, and still standing. For a long moment, no one spoke. The valley lay silent, broken, scarred, but free. What those men had done in the dark would echo far beyond those cliffs, because some battles end when the guns fall quiet, and others are remembered forever. What happened at Barbadell Puerto wasn't just another small fight in a long war. It was a message carved into history by 500 men in green. The 95th Rifles showed the world that discipline, skill, and courage could overcome even impossible odds. They weren't a grand army. They weren't heroes sculpted in marble. They were ordinary soldiers, farmers, tradesmen, sons, who stood their ground when everything said they shouldn't. In the years that followed, their reputation only grew. From the hills of Portugal to the fields of Waterloo, the green jackets became the sharp edge of Wellington's army. Their tactics, fast, precise, independent, would shape modern warfare for generations. And the spirit of those men lives on even today, in regiments that still carry the name the Rifles. When you look back on that night in 1810, the flicker of torches, the thunder of muskets, the defiance in the dark. Remember this: history isn't always written by the biggest armies. Sometimes it's written by the ones who refuse to back down. Because at Barbadell Puerto, the 95th Rifles proved one timeless truth. You don't need to outnumber the enemy to defeat them. You just need the will to stand your ground.